Hello, this is Will Harold, the Energy Hunter with Akashic Intelligence, coming to you from the mighty Rogue River in Southern Oregon with the Secret of Light group. Walter Russell, we study all things that have to do with the wave. We are currently in part 3, which is near the end of the book. I thought we might be ending this week, but it seems like we have probably one more meeting to go to finish up with the last part of part 3. Today, we're going to be talking about inert gases, which are later called the noble gases, and we're going to get into that quite a bit. So as we talk about the inert gases, we are going to talk about how they function within the wave formula. Now, this whole concept of the inert gases and Walter Russell and the wave and how those relate to the periodic table, some of you may not know, but Walter Russell expanded upon the periodic table and also said that there'd be 3 gases that were yet to be named because we couldn't actually visualize that or comprehend at the time he wrote this. This was written in the early 1900s, The Secret of Light. So there's been quite a bit of science and investigation done since then. So as we get into this, just remember that this is older science, and it's changed a bit, but really it's only really confirmed what Walter Russell has said back in the 1920s. So again, it's difficult to take what we'd call scientific materialism as we see today and actually relate it to Russell, because some of it is false narrative and different narrative. But when we talk about Walter Russell, we have to stay focused on the wave and the wave principles, or what they call waveform mechanics. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. But first, before we actually get into the book, I want to kind of go over the idea of inert gases and noble gases, which they are now called. So if you look down here in the bottom corner of this slide, it said, when the members of the group were discovered and identified, they were thought to be exceedingly rare, as well as chemically inert. So inert means that you just can't mix them together, that they don't mix well with they don't play well with others. And therefore were called the rare or inert gases. It is now known, however, that several of these elements are quite abundant on Earth and in the rest of the universe. So the designation rare is misleading. Similarly, use of the term inert has a drawback that it connotes chemically passivity, suggesting the compounds of group 18 cannot be formed. In chemistry and alchemy, the word noble has long signified the reluctance of metals such as gold and platinum to undergo chemical reactions. It applies in the same sense to the group of gases covered here. So you can use the word inert or noble interchangeably. I know that Dr. Baer actually says noble gases because that's really what they're called now. They're not really called inert gases. But in most of the diagrams that we're going to look at today, they're going to be called inert because that's what Walter Russell called them back in the 20s. And one thing I'd like to show here is, I don't know if you guys remember this, it's a little bit of review, but when we had this diagram here where we talked a bit about how these forces of radiation come in and they go, and gravitation come, and they go to the center of the Earth because of these curved planes of pressure, right? Remember how we talked about this, Doug?
I remember.
As they come into the center. So the idea is that as these forces come in from the sun to the center of the Earth, they get compressed. And as they get compressed, they get denser and denser and denser. And so what I did here was, where you see these lines here, which we call the dynamic axes, and this is the, this is the static axis. This is the static axis, and this is the dynamic axis. So on the static axis here, what I did was I just kind of, showed the Earth here and then showed these kind of, curved lines of force, which would be actually mimic these lines. Does everybody understand what I'm trying to get at there? That there's these curved lines.
So the gases are actually in the air though, like
Yeah.
that?
Yeah. Well, again, what I'm trying to show here is that there are these curved pressures, right? And each of these elements are formed by the pressures as they get closer and closer to the center of the Earth, okay? So the idea would be that the farther out they are, right, the less dense they are. As they get closer and closer to the Earth, they become more and more dense. That's why you find like the densest elements like uranium and those type of things that are the most dense closer to the center or core of the earth, farther in the ground. So all the gases, all these gases are in our atmosphere, but they also are in other elements in the ground that can be extracted. But as we look at this, so as you'd see here, so, you know, on the outside would be helium, the farthest out, neon, argon, krypton, xenon, and radon. Now, Walter Russell calls radon maybe a different name, but for right now, we're just going to look right now. So you have the concept that the farther out are these pressures that come in, they're conical in shape, and they begin to press these elements of light. Okay, so as the light comes in, it gets more and more and more pressurized, which means it is what? It is more condensed. What is condensing it? Gravitation, right? The gravitation wave that comes in, which is positive, begins to compress, right? Begins to compress the radiation that's being thrown out by the sun. Once it gets to the center of the earth, it begins to radiate back out. So the helium would come in, it would go back out, and then return to helium. It could be compressed down. And we're going to see that when we look at the periodic table again and the wave within the table. So if we just look at some of these properties of the noble gases, if you looked at the atomic number, what would you expect? Would you expect helium to have a high number or a low number?
Low, because I can read it.
Exactly. So as these gases, you know, come down, their atomic number and also their atomic weight increases, right? Why is that? Because they're getting more and more condensed by gravitation. They're brought down and, you know, into matter, right? So we're taking these substances, which are, you know, and they're being brought down and coming into matter, into form. And the more they condense by gravitation, which is positive, which is red, right? As they are brought down, then they begin to, so all of the properties of helium are going to be less, right, than those of the next ones in the table. So again, when we look at this, we're talking about this curved plane of pressure that's bringing the light waves down. And as they are brought down through gravitation, they're condensed and greater mass. And so again, here's another little light rays are radial when projected through spherical planes, right? There's a spherical plane. They're being condensed as they come down.
What is the light? Is it saying that the light is these gases though?
Correct. All things are light. So light is the basis of all material that we see. So as the light comes down, right, it forms these gases. It
becomes the gas. Okay.
Yeah. So light is what is condensed. You know, that's what's condensed by these gravitational planes, these spherical planes, as it's condensed through. So as they come through what we call the convex, right? The convex, they get condensed. When they go out, right? So this is like, you know, coming as they go out this way. So this is, you know, like pointing down, right? So it's like a dome that they're going through the top of the dome. That's what causes them to compress, just like, say, like maybe with a magnifying glass or something, right? As they leave, they're going out through this other way, which will make them expand. So as they go out, they'll radiate. As they come in, they'll gravitate, condense, going out, radiate. So those are the principles basically of how the light comes into form through Walter Russell's cosmology of how all this works. Any more questions before we move on to the next slide?
There's no light going back out though, right?
Well, yeah. Well, the light is the sun. Yeah, because they're all waves, Doug. So the waves are going to go back and return back to the sun.
So it's not physical light that I could see though.
No, and well, yes, okay. and again, light's kind of a misnomer because once you get into space is not lit by light itself. Light is the only thing that our eyes are picking up. So the eyes are actually picking up the vibrational quality it's coming through.
Okay.
Okay. So here we go. The inert gases, and again, we can say the noble gases. The octaves of the elements of matter grow from seed, just as all things grow from seed. And again, we covered this a bit last week at the very end, if you remember. It's kind of boring, but it talked about this was the seed before that, and so on and so forth, which was from this periodic table here, which I've actually pasted on a bigger portion in the middle, so that it can actually, we can actually read it better. From their seed, so from the moment the element unfold their seed, they are a constant state of transition from the beginning of their cycle to the end. Elements are not fixed created things. They are pressure conditions, right? Just as we showed, as those things come through those planes, those convex, they're pressure conditions of light waves. So there's the answer to your question, Doug. They are pressure conditions of light waves. Those conditions of light pressures are constantly changing from infancy to old age in the elements of matter, just as they are in the animal kingdom. The inert gases, or noble gases, are cosmic elements which will not combine with any other elements. Therefore, that's why they were called inert. It's been found that they can be combined, but not in natural processes. Usually it has to be, science, kind of like a man-made process in which they combine things through extended pressure, higher pressure than what is seen in nature. Those conditions of light pressure constantly changing from infancy to old age in the elements of matter. The inert gases are cosmic elements which will not combine with other elements. They constitute the recording system of this creating universe. They surround the zero from which motion springs and to which it returns. They represent minimum motion in the wave, just as amplitudes represent maximum motion. They are the seeds of the octaves of matter, and each octave has a different seed, just as different trees have different seeds. Elements are waves, and waves disappear and reappear. God's recording system does not allow any creating thing to disappear without recording the action and reaction of its stages of appearance. All states of motion are recorded in the inert gases. In the inert gases are the souls of their bodily manifestation in the universe of motion. In them is desire for expression and the patterned form of their desire. So what we're talking about here is, if you look here, I pasted this on over the top so it's bigger. So I really cut a portion out of this bigger wave, periodic table in the back to actually show this where it could be seen a little bit better. So
did you switch the screen? I'm still seeing the same picture.
Yeah, it's the same picture.
Oh, very good. Sorry.
Okay. So as we see all these 0 points going down the center here, so these are all the areas of the inert gases at the 0 point, what we call the zero, or, it's really the inflection of the wave itself here. So the one that we're going to look at really is this one right here, which is where we start with the helium as the noble gas or inert gas. And this will then go down to this point towards carbon. But as it compresses, it starts at lithium, barium, boron, carbon, okay? So all these that are in red, right, are the positive, right? Positive, red, male, right? They are gravitational. Gravitational forces are positive, red, male, right? That's what they are. They are compressing. They get to carbon, which is what our life form is, right? We are a carbon-based life form. And then they start turning blue, right? Which means they begin to radiate back. So from carbon, we begin to radiate back out again. And that's why they're shown as blue, right? Radiation is, sorry, this is not negative, this is positive. These are negative, they're blue, they're female. So they begin to radiate out, they begin to expand. That's why when you see these numbers over here, there's a 1, 2, and 3, which is plus, 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 right? Because this is red, it's positive, it's male. That's why these are negative, 1, 2, 3. They're nitrogen, oxygen, and fluorine. So these are the radiative cycle, right? So we go from positive gravitational to 0 carbon, back out again to radiate to the next inert gas, which is neon here, right? So this would be considered the trough, of the wave. This would be considered the peak of the wave. So oftentimes they'll talk about the seeds, what are the seeds? Carbon could be the seed. As we talked about last week, the next phase of the wave here, because from carbon to silicon is a complete cycle of the wave, as we talked about in the past. From here to here is the complete cycle of the wave. So as you remember last week, we talked a little bit about, becoming robots or machines or whatever. And so in the wave itself, right, the next iteration of the wave form that we'll come to will be silicon. And so that's kind of the idea, like I discussed a little bit about, was where not Walter Russell, Steiner and some others have said that, our natural evolution will be into the machine or into probably a silicon-based entity or being, because that's really kind of the progression of the wave and where it's going. I don't know if that's true or not, but again, that's kind of the reasoning behind that theory, that our next, in evolution of the human will be into a silicon type life form.
Well, it's scary shit. You know that, right?
Well, I'm not saying it's not scary. I'm just saying that's the idea.
Considering what's going on right
Yeah,
now is what
exactly.
I mean.
Well, and we see it. We see, the idea of robots and silicon-based life forms coming into being right now, right? We have, these sex robots and all this. What do you think is on the outside of those?
The point they want to turn us all into their control things.
But again, what we are seeing is there is an evolution of life form, right? Again, I don't know how it's all going to work. I don't know if it's, if we all have choices or what's going on with that. I'm just saying that's that's the idea, that the wave and its progression is going to lead to a silicon-based life form. So the cosmic inert gases fill all spaces between the stars of heaven. So, because as they go out, right, these gases, they fill the empty spaces, which we would call space, which would be, so in between those, they insulate states of motion from each other by their balancing zero. They bring all motion into being through the will of the creator. True to the pattern of desire, they are the source of balancing cosmic rays which interchange between zero and matter. They vitalize matter with the omnipotence of creative desire, which lies within the zero of the cosmic rays. So what this is saying, right, at one time we had one discussion about, what is motion, right, and what is life. And at that time, Walter Russell said, if you look back at one of the videos where I think I have like a Frankenstein on the front, the scientific materialist is, electrifying the matter and saying it's alive because it's moving. And Walter Russell saying movement is not life, right? Movement is not consciousness. And so what this is saying here is that they vitalize matter with the omnipotence of creative desire. So what Walter Russell's saying is that as this light comes into matter, it becomes vitalized. Okay, and when we say vitalized, that doesn't mean just motion, right? It doesn't mean just movement. It means that we become we become conscious at this point, and that is from the desire of the creator. So that's the difference between, like, say, a scientific materialist who said we're all just matter, we're animals, or our mind is just an electric mechanical thing that's going on. And Walter Russell has always said the one thing he really wants to get is that we all are actually from source, and it's from source that we derive all power. It's not through our movement, it's not through our muscles, it's not through our strength that the power is given. It's through the creator. And once we can connect with that, then we can actually get into knowing and do some other things. And we get out of this scientific mind, we get out of the electric mind, and we get out of the senses of thinking only. So they vitalize matter with the omnipotence of creative desire, which lies within the zero of this cosmic ray. So within the zero, right, is the still magnetic light that we've talked about many times, that still magnetic light. There are 9 cosmic gases, the first and last being one. Alphanon begins the cycle and ends it. There is no beginning and no ending, because it just keeps going, right? The cycle just keeps going. There is no end of the cycle. The cycle keeps going, right? So the list of cosmic gases follows: Alphanon, betanon, gammanon, helium, neon, argon, krypton, xenon, and niton. So when we look at that, right, those aren't the names of all the gases. So like, you know, argon was the last after, so they're a bit differently called than what he's calling them here now. If we go back, you know, we have helium, neon, argon, krypton, xenon, and radon is what is in science today. So they're a bit different, and there's not 8 shown. But he's saying there's 8 because of the octave. So there may still be additional gases to be found. And so, you know, as we looked at this chart, and again, like I said, I enlarged this. So this actually, you know, is this chart below, but it just goes to the 6th wave here. I also brought in this keyboard that is on the internet that I've seen a couple of times. And with that, I actually, you know, looked at this chart. So as you see here, yellow, right? We see carbon. So I put carbon on this key, right? And you see boron, beryllium, lithium, and helium. So that would be
helium twice, no?
Yeah, well, that's because it begins at helium. Is it helium? Is that right? And ends. So that's the 0 gas. So it begins and ends, and that's, we kind of talked about the beginning and ending of the octave. And then on the other side, you have nitrogen, oxygen, and fluorine, which is over here on the other side. Now, I think this keyboard's actually backwards. I think that we should have the pluses, just like here, as you see here, we have +3, 2, 1. See that, to 0 here? 1, 2, 3, see that? +1, 2, 3. So I really think that, you know, this should be over here. So I believe that it should, you know, that the keyboard's kind of flipped.
No, that's your middle C.
No, this is actually G. If you go look at this right here, the way they have it set up here with the yellow, they actually are calling that middle key G, or yellow. And it's kind of, you know, so they go G, F, E, D here. So G, F, E, D back to C. So, you know, but then on the other side, they're saying, you know, it goes F, E. So they're not really going through with A, B, C, D on the other side. They're going through with F, E, D on the other side back to C.
Well, backwards, forwards, doesn't it just matter whether you're standing on your head or not?
Well, not really, because of the sign, because of see, on this is the negative, positive, and these come, and you know, I guess it could really be thought about is, and Grant may know more about this than I do, but I would say, since these are higher vibration, right, the keys that would be to my left on the keyboard would be a higher resonance, right? They're a higher note. As I go to the right, you get down to your lower keys, right? Which would be a lower vibrance, a lower vibrational. So I would think that your higher keys, right? Aren't the higher keys on the right or
The
left?
higher keys should be on the right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Higher on the right. Okay. So that's so the higher keys are on the right. So, and then as you move to the left, so this is probably shown, it's just probably shown in juxtaposition to this, because this isn't really a keyboard. So the keyboard may be backwards on the piano compared to what the table is, right?
Right.
And
it's almost as if they just put like a mirror up, you know, so it's
exactly
like actually a full keyboard, like you're saying.
But again, like I'm saying, you know, since lithium is down here, right, to the right, which is where the higher keys are, right? Is that what we're saying?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that would be a higher vibrational, right, for the higher key?
Yeah, a higher octave.
Correct. Just like here, right? So as we look at the chart over here, this would be the higher octave, right? And then because we're going to be going down and down into density, down and down into lower octaves, right? So with this, as we go down into the lower octaves, then those would be the lower keys. So that would be the lower tonal keys on the piano also, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So here I kind of just put them all together, right? Put a lot of them together so you kind of see all the correlations that are going on. So in this diagram here, you know, we actually have the keys with the notes, as I talked about, with the, you know, with the gases shown. So again, we see the carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, fluorine back to helium, and same again from the carbon, boron, beryllium, lithium back to helium, as Doug was asking about. earlier. So we have helium on both ends. That's the repeat of that note to get to the octave that we talked about. And again, it follows with the do. So what we're saying here is that light and sound have a definite correlation, right? The difference may be in how do we sense them and what is the resonance that we have with the notes, because sound travels slower than light, right? We know that, even though neither one really travels, it is just an aspect or a recording on the wave. And this was a question I think that we were talking about on our group one day was, does Walter Russell believe in photons? Because a photon is supposedly this particle that's moving through space. And the first thing is does Walter Russell believe in particles? Well, to Walter Russell, what a particle is this recording that we talked about in the last slide. It's the capture of that information at that point in that gravitational field that becomes aware to our senses. So as these things are being recorded, right? So just think about, that it's kind of like, it's kind of like the wave in a stadium. Okay. These people stand up with their hands and they sit back down. Now, are they moving in that wave? No, but we see it as a motion around because each particle is being lit up. And so that's what's happening. As we see these waves light up in the field as they come through, we have an illusion of motion that's not really there, but we see the recording of that, intersection of those waves with a field.
Like they're on the wave, right?
Well, they would actually be like, say, at this point and at this point, right? So we're seeing that point, we're seeing this point, and that then becomes motion to us, right? So as they pass through these fields, we begin to see them or hear them. I mean, it depends on what sense we're using and what type of wave it is. So oftentimes, I think it's been said that light is sound we can't hear, and sound is light we can't see, right? So we can hear and we can see, we can taste. I mean, they're all waves. Any of our 5 senses we have are actually just, our instrument for registering that instance, that recording of the wave in the field. So when, Walter Russell talked about earlier, we were talking about this cinematic screen that we were watching, that it was all false, and that was the recording. So as we watch this recording, it may differ in what sense we use to actually, notice or see or smell or taste or bring that into reality for us. So, as we go through the different wave fields, as we go through these different iterations of the light wave, our senses may not pick up all sounds. We know that, right? We know dogs can hear more than we can, right? We know that owls and birds can actually, and cats can see in a greater spectrum than we can. There is more light out there. There is other things. I mean, there may be beings that we don't have the senses to see because within our resonance and within our fields, we've either, not developed. I believe we have the abilities, but we have not developed those abilities to actually, bring those resonances into our reality. Doesn't mean they don't exist because they're not in our reality. Just like those sounds, we can't say those sounds don't exist because we know they do, but they're not in our reality, right?
Not currently. They might have been before.
They might have been before, and again, it happens with the people who go deaf, right? They lose their range of, or blind, they lose that range of resonance. So, the idea is that it's almost in a biblical sense where, it says that God spoke, and that became light, right? So it's like the vibrational quality begins and then it begins to flare out, and that then becomes condensed and then it becomes into our reality. Any questions before we get into spectrum analysis? All right, we're gonna move on then. So the known octaves which lie within the range of perception, we just talked about that, are 5 1/2. These begin with the 1/3 of hydrogen octave and end with the uranium group, which are isotopes of actinium and thorium, in the last octave. So we talked about that. So that's the 8th octave. And the other ones we covered a bit. The invisible octaves of finely divided matter of space are 3 1/2 in number. These octaves are beyond our range of perception, but they are not beyond our range of knowing. So this is why Walter Russell could actually name those other 3 gases before they were actually discovered, because within his knowing, he knew they should be there, or that they were there through his knowing. This is through his connection with source or with one, or whatever we want to say. Light is a universal language. Through spectrum analysis of light waves, man has been able to analyze and recognize each element when it is in its incandescent stage. By means of the spectroscope, he has been able to divide light rays through its prism into the components parts which make up the life history of each stage of its two-way cycle. So if you look down here, this is the hydrogen spectrum. So they have it coming in here, it comes through the prism, is divided out, and then its actual ray is taken out as this kind of red ray here. So this is the way that through spectral analysis, you can actually determine what the gas is or what the element is that you're looking at. So as they come through, they'll give off a certain spectrum, and through that wavelength, that will determine what the, so then here's the wavelength. So we got this wavelength within here, right? So this is kind of the spectrum of that wavelength. So each element tells the story of its entire previous incarnation and other octaves. Since its beginning, any line in one octave is repeated in the next, but shifted in position because of the changing pressures of each succeeding octave. So what we're saying is as these rays come in, right, they begin to be pressurized, right, by these other fields that we've talked about. They begin to become pressurized. As they go through, they still keep their initial, substance that they started with, but they do change their character. And so as they go through, they shift as the pressure shifts, right? So as the pressure shifts, they actually expand this way, right? So they get denser and denser and denser. The spectrum of hydrogen is predominantly red. So we look down here at the hydrogen spectrum, it comes out as kind of a pinky red wave, right? That's because it's predominantly red. Why is that? Well, I mean, it's coming through the spectrum, right? A simple history of hydrogen as compared to the complex spectrum of iron is like the history of an obscure youth as compared to that of as Napoleon. So the less dense the gas, the lower number of the octave, the more simple it gets. As we compress down, we begin to compress elements together, right? And as we compress the elements together, we get denser and denser and more complex also. In the spectrum analysis of iron, the lines which belong to iron and those which tell its recent and remote history can be seen at a glance. These lines also indicate the relative ability of iron atom to change or to charge or discharge. So again, the charge and the discharge, right? We're talking about this ability to actually interact with other elements. Any questions before we move on from the spectrum analysis? Oh, let me go up here. I almost forgot. So over here, we talk about the noble gases absorb and emit electromagnetic radiation in a much less complex way than do other substances. So once they become charged, they actually emit electromagnetic radiation. This behavior is used in discharge lamps and fluorescent lighting devices. If any noble gas is confined at low pressure in a glass tube, and electrical discharge is passed through it, the gas will glow. Neon produces a familiar orange-red color of advertising signs. Xenon emits a beautiful blue color. So if you look up here, what this actually is very similar to Rife's invention that he used when he was working with his Rife resonances. So what he would do was he would send a resonance, right, through a frequency generator that would go into, this device here, these, just like a ballast on a fluorescent lamp, that would send the charge into I think he used mostly xenon, and he might have used some other elements too, but usually they glow in a purple or blue color from the ones I've seen. And then from that, it would emit out these frequencies, these rays, and that's how he said he would heal people. Some people said, oh, well, it's unhealthy because it's putting out these, radiation waves. But, this is the way some people got healed. This is still in effect today. Spooky also puts out a similar device that you can use. You can, like I said, there's different ways that you can receive frequencies for the body. You can receive it.
It doesn't use light, does it? Spooky uses light?
They have one of these also, yeah. Again, all Spooky really is, right? It's based on Rife technology, but it's a frequency generator.
Yeah, I bought one. I haven't looked at it.
Yeah, but when you buy that, you can actually hook it up to like pads you stick on your arm, which is called a contact, and that would you can put it directly on your body. You can actually use what they have, what is called their quantum entanglement device, where you put your fingernail clippings in, and no matter where you are, you're supposedly be able to get treatment through that, because you're quantumly entangled by the atoms that are in you, and that they always stay connected. So they have the quantum entanglement, they have the contact method, and this would be called the plasma.
You'd have to buy a plasma thing.
Correct.
It doesn't come with it, right?
Correct. And it's probably the most expensive way to go. And then there's also the scalar generator they have.
Yeah, those are 2 boxes now, right?
Yeah. Yes, and I have those also.
Those are
So
pretty cool.
yeah, so again, how the frequency is delivered, is really kind of up to how you think that the actual, what's the most efficient way to do that, the efficacy of the treatment. But again, you could use frequency within tuning forks, right? You're just delivering it through the ear. So how you really want to deliver frequency and waveform is really based upon how you might receive it the best, or how much money you have. I mean, tuning forks are like $500, probably to do a whole Spooky things, probably $1,200 if you want to do the scalars, another $16. So, how you want to receive, treatment, in the most, it really depends on what works for you best too. If you're deaf, you're not going to probably use tones, even though I would believe some people would say you don't have to hear them to actually feel the tones, because your body's resonating with it, but you wouldn't be hearing it. So any questions on spectrum analysis before we move on to the next slide?
Where does laser light fit in there? Like when my TCM or my homeopath use laser to
laser usually goes
to heal something,
goes through a crystal usually, doesn't it? I would believe that it's probably going to pick up, the light's probably going to pick up some of the properties of that crystalline structure. And it's almost like, here where on the bottom here, we're going through this prism to where you're taking a light, and whatever prism you're using, right, you're getting out that color or that resonance that you want, right, that vibrational quality, and then that would actually focus that spectral quality.
We had like a trigger, right? I mean, I used one of those ones. Someone used it on me once.
Yeah, but again, what you're letting a light out, right? A light beam out. It's usually going through a crystal or something, and then creating a light. So
they tape it on your ankle, I think I had.
So that's that. Again, I'm just intuiting that, Giselle.
Yeah, it didn't do shit.
Yeah.
Okay, so the way.
I have a question.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
Is that spectrum analysis the same thing that I'd be familiar with, like that astrophysicists use to identify elements on distant bodies?
Correct. And that's what we talked about a little bit earlier, was that's how, they say a star is hydrogen, right? Because as they go through the spectral analysis, they actually see the red, right? So they're saying, stars are hydrogen gas, right? Because of the spectral analysis. They can also look at other planets and maybe look at different, maybe Jupiter has, more iron, or Mars has a lot of iron, right? Because the spectrum, it's red and has a lot of this spectral analysis of iron and so on. So yes, that's exactly, you're correct.
And the geologist would also do the same thing with a rock, trying to find out what's in.
Correct. That's exactly right. So through spectral analysis, and we're going to get into a little bit more of that. I don't know if it's the next, So here you go. here's what we talked about. So the wavelength, you know, we have this wavelength property, right? Which is, if we go back here, then this spectral analysis, right? We have kind of this wavelength property here of 718 L8 is immediately recognizable as belonging to iron in its present octave. 6916.8 is recent history, and 6944.8 is extremely remote history. Herein follows a partial list of lines whose wavelengths belong to iron. They had a list that it's not really that interesting to look at, so I kind of put this over it. The visible and invisible spectrum is divided into several thousand lines. Each line is different in its shade of color and in its plane. Each line proves that the universe of varying motion in a universe of varying pressures. So to get back to the question that was asked, how to identify the composition of stars, right? You'd go through this spectral analysis. When heated, each element emits its own unique and distinct pattern of wavelengths of light. Again, back to Doug's question, everything is made of light. This is known as spectral fingerprint. Just as you have fingerprints on your hand, each of these elements have their own fingerprint of their spectral analysis. By using a database of these fingerprints, astronomers can identify the composition of a distant object. For example, the spectral pattern produced by a star is shown below. It matches the spectral fingerprint of hydrogen. Therefore, we know that the star is composed of hydrogen gas. So yeah, so as we get back to this, we can see that each of these items, and that would make sense, right? Because a star, we have hydrogen, you know, farther back in our spectral analysis. When you look at this wave here, you know, we have hydrogen as part of the wave. It's one of the inert gases we talked about, right, at the beginning. And we have helium and so on. Hydrogen can form the basis of the star. And this over here on the left-hand side is just another kind of chart showing how, as these pressures become denser and denser, the composition becomes denser within the element and falls within, you know, we have the blue up here, the blue violet to blue to green to yellow to white to yellow to orange to red. So again, this is the red shift, blue shift that we talk about, as we've talked about many times, between the male and the female, right? So blue is radiative, right? Blue is negative, blue is female, red is male, red is positive, red is gravitational. Any questions on this wavelength or spectral analysis to determine the colors or the spectrum and to identify elements?
What does that say at the bottom? All pressure zones are restrained, sustained by something?
Where are you seeing that down here?
Yeah, that last line.
Well, right here, this is
Oh,
all
the bottom,
right
yeah,
here.
that.
All
yeah.
energy is expressed in waves. All waves are divided into pressure zones. All pressure zones are sustained by pressure.
Yeah, that's
so,
what I was asking, by what?
yeah, so it's just really saying that all these waves, right? We have the waves as they enter into fields, they become pressurized, and then they become into matter, and these matters become into either, you know, gases or follow down into solid objects. So the atomic structure, right? Now, this is a question that's been going on. Again, Walter Russell wrote this in the 1920s, 30s, somewhere in there, right? The elements of matter are not different substances or different things. So the elements of matter are not different substances or different things. They are different pressures. What is the one thing they all are?
Light.
Light, exactly. They're all light, but the light is being pressurized to form different instances, right? That's really what they are, a different instance as it comes in contact with a different pressure zone. So within its wave cycle, as it will cycle through, you know, from the very initial inert gas or noble gas all the way down to radium and, you know, all those other, you know, minerals and things at the very bottom, isotopes on the bottom, they will go back out back into as they radiate back, they will go back to the beginning. So the cycle We don't live in circles, right? We live in cycles. So the light units of the elements are all alike, but are differently conditioned by the electric pressures exerted upon them during the inward or outward spiral journey, right? So inward journey, centripetal, positive, male, blue, father, right? And the outward journey is negative. It's blue, sorry, the other one was red. Blue, negative, mother, female, radiation, right? So we have this inward and outward spiral occurring from 0 to 0, just as we saw in the octave wave. Remember how we started at 0 and went out? I mean, that's how these things work, right? It's the pendulum. It's the cosmic pendulum. The inward breath, right? Positive, life. Outward breath, radiation, death, right? Part of the cycle. These are the cycles, the cosmic pendulum. The unanswered mystery of how the elements become mathematically precise octave tones, just as musical tones or color tones of the spectrum are mathematically precise in vibration orderliness, lies in the wave field gyroscopic principle. So a gyroscope, right? What's a gyroscope do? Spins, right? Turns. It's radial. Together, the 8 elements of an octave form 2 halves of one cycle of tones, which ascend from 0 to the 404 position of amplitude and then descend again, right? So we talked about that. You know, it can be seen here, right? 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? This is the cosmic pendulum. This is what we're talking about. We're talking about this. We're talking about, you know, these octave waves that go down. So all we're really talking about, he's just really, you know, explaining in greater detail this idea of these 8 elements of an octave from 2 halves, right? The 2 halves start at 0, go out as we talked about. Tones which ascend from 0 to the 404 position, 404, 4 times 2, 8 octave of amplitude, and then descend again to 0 to begin anew. So from of amplitude and descend again, right? So this spiral journey contracts into greater pressures as it approaches wave field amplitude position at spiral apices and expand into lower ones that return journey to spiral bases. So as we go back here, right, we talk about, so we're talking about amplitude, right? This is a wave from here to here. So we have an, you know, apex up here, right? We have a base down here. So this is where the wave is traveling to and then returns back down again. So the 2-wave spiral journey of each half cycle extends between 6 mirrors of still light, which compose the wave field, and winds around a still shaft, which centers the spiral. We've seen this many times. This is the vortex that we talk about. The center shaft, what's that called? We call that the dynamic axis, right? It is a compression wave, right? The other one, which we have, which spins around this, is what we call a transverse wave, right? And so we've talked about this a little bit last week. We're going to get into a little bit more about this, but this is kind of an amazing thing right here. So for over 87 years, science taught us that these balls were electrons, right? This thing right here. Remember this? This looks like the atom that we saw on all the nuclear signs. In the 1950s, Walter Russell taught all electric current is concentric rings. So this is Walter Russell's idea of the atom, right? These rings, compression rings, right? As we move into these centers, right? As we move into the center, we form these compression rings that bring matter into existence. On May 28, 2013, so how long is that? 9 years ago? A little bit less than 9 years. Science uses a high-tech quantum microscope to see how electrons, inert gas rings, actually look. And how do they look?
Exactly like he said.
Exactly like he said. Now, how did he know that, right? How did he know that without an electron microscope?
Yeah.
Knowing, right?
It's connected, yeah.
So the idea that this is how an atom looks to what this looks like looks very familiar, right? So the cosmic, if you look at this one here, you know, these are different views of this shaft. See the shaft coming through here? You know, this is what we talked about, the shaft coming through, the centering shaft, right? To these points of light, red and blue coming together, red shift, blue shift, coming to the middle to the yellow point. The cosmic inert gases fill all space between the stars of heaven. They insulate states of motion from each other. We talked about this, right? So they are the source of balancing cosmic rays, which interchange between zero and matter. They vitalize matter with the omnipotence of the creative desire, which lies within the zero. So again, we're talking about that. The zero is the magnetic light, right? The white magnetic light. That through pressurization, through gravitation and radiation, forms matter. And the greater the pressurization, the denser the form. The less the pressurization, the more light the form is. So that's why we get the gases farther out. That's why we get matter, and the denser the matter, the closer we go to the center of the earth, or the center of the sphere, the cosmic sphere that we talk about. So this, you know, this is a better diagram of these 6 planes that we talked about in the previous slide. So when we see this, we see, so if we see this plane right here, that's one plane, that's 2 planes, and this is a 3rd plane. So this is 3D reality. Right? We're talking about 3D reality. So that's what we're talking right now. When we discuss matter, we're talking about 3D, 3-dimensional reality, not 4D, not 5D. This is 3D reality. So the 3 of action are the inner intersection planes of the cube. The 3 of reaction are the outer boundary planes of the wave field. So these are the outer boundary planes of the wave field, these 3. All these planes of the wave field. So we've now gone from just talking about the wave, right, to the wave field, right? So the wave is a 2-dimensional, a field is a 3-dimensional object. All of these planes of the wave field are of 0 curvature, so they're flat. But the spiral universe, which is forming within those planes, is curved. So we see this line that's coming through here, right? It's a curved line. It's the wave that we've talked about. Curved planes of light act as 2-way lenses, which bend light to focal points and extend it from those focal points radially. And we talked about that with the other, we showed the Earth and how that was all as the light came in radially through the curved wave fields. As the 2-way spirals of forming matter extend from the wave field, center in opposite directions toward wave field intersections. The 6 mirror planes of still light focus 3 points of still light upon the still shaft of each half cycle. Centers are formed at these focal points, which become the 1, 2, 3 positive and negative elements of matter by rotating gyroscopically upon the wheels of light, which act as equators for those honing tones. So again, what are we talking about? Gyroscopically, right? We're talking about a torus field. We're talking about these spiraling waveforms that are forming a toroidal structure around the centering, or what we would call the gravitational axis, right? They're going around that, and they're beginning to form into matter the things that we see. And as they get closer towards their centers, as they get to the centers, then they begin to come back out. But this is a wave that's acting in both. It just doesn't spin in and then gets to a point and spins out. They're acting at the same time, but one, they're interchanging. So if this is at 0.75, you know, this is like at 2.5, right? So they're interchanging until they get to a point to where the other one begins to dominate, press out. So they're actually in the cycle going through it, but interchanging at the same time. Multiplying and dividing pressures determine the density and volume of each succeeding element. The color spectrum records these pressures as a complete history of every element from octave to octave of the whole 9 octaves of the element. So the color spectrum records it. So that is really kind of almost an Akashic record, right? That is beginning to record. So we have a record of all elements within the color spectrum, just as we did a spectral analysis on these elements. That is a color spectrum that is actually recording, as he says here, every element from the octave to octave. So there's always a corresponding color and wave to each of these elements and to each thing that we see in matter. Multiplying pressures of the spiral also affect the curvature of its light lens to such an extent that the focusing position change their mathematical ratios in conformity with the acceleration of gravity and the deceleration of radiation. So we talked about this a bit last week. Remember when we actually showed some of the scales and tones and, you know, the mathematical equations for that. There are also, you know, Walter has his own mathematical equations for how do we get to some of these constants. If you look at the work of Robert Grant, I've talked about a little bit about him. He gets very much into the mathematics and into some of the constants for different aspects of reality and ratios. So Walter doesn't really get into a lot of the math, but he talks a bit about it. He talks that there is constants, that there is ratios that stay constant. And those ratios, you know, are talked about in quite a bit of detail by Robert Grant. Again, down here, you know, again, we see the cube, right, that we've talked about. So within this cube, this four-sided cube, we have these other planes that we're talking about, the three-dimensional planes that this wave works through. And we've talked a little bit about this east, west, and so on, some of the previous discussions we've had. And then here's kind of like a artist rendering that's on the site of philosophy.org, which is the Walter Russell site, which actually kind of shows what they call the cubosphere, which is the sphere inside the cube. So this cube here is actually, you know, this cube here with the sphere inside.
Oh, tomatoes.
Tomatoes could be. So now we're going to look at this actually. So the position of focal centers of gyroscopic wheels upon the wave shaft are thus affected as diagrammed in figure 76. So here we go, you know, we're seeing this wave come through here, you know, forming this three-dimensional wave field. We see the colors being generated here at these points. So each element is the square of the distance to and from the succeeding one in accordance with the direction. The direction of gravity is the inverse square, and the opposite direction is the direct square. So we're talking about radiation and gravitation here, right? The inverse, and what is their ratio to each other? The volume of each succeeding element is likewise affected directly and inversely as the cube. 6 of the 8 gyroscopic wheels of the whole octave are thus accounted for by geometric positioning of two-way exposed lights through each other from 2 sets of 3 mirror boundary fields. So we talked about the 3 mirror boundary fields, right? 1, 2, and 3 mirror boundary fields. The fourth double tone is formed at the rest point where 8 cube wave fields meet. This is the point of rest, which is known as the center of gravity in Earths or suns where motion and curvature cease. So when you look at this diagram here, so what he's showing here is that the corner of the cube is kind of the centering point for where, you know, even galaxies or whatever would be the centering point for each of these as they begin to form their matter into existence. For this reason, the 404 position is one of balance, in which the yellow of orange is the dominating color of one of its 2 gyroscopic wheels, and the yellow of green is the other, centered by white. So the corners of the cube of motion are the points of north, which become the gravity's centers of all systems formed on the carbon line in the bisexual position of 4 plus. All systems forming on the ecliptic planes of the wave are self-reproducing. Their nuclei, suns, are true spheres. The orbits of their planets are true circles. That's kind of different, true circles. There are no precessional orbits. Their crystallization is in true cube. Their power of attraction and repulsion is maximum, and their melting points are the highest in their octaves. So again, this is getting into, a much more elaborate picture of how all these galaxies, all these things are working together based upon their compression into the cube and forming spheres. And then from those spheres, like the sun, is thrown off matter, which is then thrown off through radiation, is condensed in the coldest space through gravitation, and then is thrown back off through radiation back to the sun to be reconciled and thrown back off again. So this is kind of Walter's idea of how the universe is living, how that cosmic pendulum works of inhale, exhale, inhale gravitation, exhale radiation, inhale positive, red, father, right, life, exhale, blue, cold, mother, negative, out. So this is the idea of this cosmic pendulum that's constantly at work, but it's being formed by this idea of this cosmic cube with these mirror planes. This is Walter's idea here of how all this is being formed. And again, from this is created the periodic table. From this is created all the different states of matter, from gas to solid, from solid back to gas. Any questions before we move on?
Just an observation that this man is pretty amazing.
Especially when he did it, when things are being confirmed now is really kind of nice, right? I mean, there's a lot of things that are now being confirmed.
Yeah.
So at the 2 points upon the still shaft of the turning sphere where the shaft penetrates its surface are the magnetic poles of still light. Now, I think you guys might have remembered this diagram from a previous one when we talked about this. This actually kind of explains it a bit more as we talk about this diagram. This diagram wasn't in this portion of the book. I brought it in from other areas. So surface are the magnetic poles. So the magnetic poles here, are the north and south magnetic poles that we're talking about, right? They go through and so, this is where we're showing the difference between the positive and negative side. So, when it's used, the magnetic poles are skewed this way, right? And it's turning, but it's skewed. And then the light's actually coming in off those poles. It's not directly on it. As it reaches maturity, the centering shaft actually becomes the magnetic poles. And then we actually see that the poles actually shift in polarity as we get into declination, as we begin to decline. And then as we age, they actually reverse again. And the south goes to the top. So one is they reverse polarity first, and then they reverse location. So these are different signs of aging within a planet. So one of these is the north magnetic pole, which controls the winding of the sphere into density, right? Gravitation into density, gravity, positive, male, red, right? We got the centripetal by centripetal electric force, and the other is the south magnetic pole, which is unwinding through centrifugal into space. So this is radiation. So one is gravitational, winding in, one is radiation, winding out. The elements of matter are miniature stellar systems. So the idea is that, when you talk about the outer cosmos and the inner cosmos, it even gets down to the atomic cosmos, right? They're all the same. The way they work, the way they appear, the way they look, they're all the same, just in magnitude, right? Just in size, just in relativity. So the elements of matter are miniature stellar systems. Every principle and law which applies to one applies to the other. The solar system is a gyroscopic wheel, again, gyroscopic, in the position which iron occupies in the elemental series. When it spirals a little further, it will correspond to a carbon atom. The sun will then be a true sphere. The sun will then be a true sphere, and its new planets will also be true spheres. The gyroscopic principle accounts for that law of nature which causes like elements to seek other. All decomposing compounds are sorted out element by element gyroscopically. The efforts of man to transmute. Now, this is one thing that Bear talked a lot about, is how can we actually maybe transmute? Do we, do we need to mine minerals? Do we need to, mine gold or mine these things? Or can we actually transmute? This is kind of the alchemist, right? This is the Philosopher's Stone idea. So we're talking about transmutation. So the efforts of man to transmute one element into another must be governed by this principle, right? So what principle is that? That the gyroscopic principle accounts for that law of nature, which causes like elements to see each other. All decomposing compounds are sorted out element gyroscopically, right? So how can we use this principle to transmute one element to another? And not upon the theory that another substance will be obtained by knocking off one electron. So the idea is that, each element has a certain amount of electrons, and as we see these electrons, if we knock one off, that will transmute it back. And he's saying, no, that's not how it works. Okay. The way it works is that we actually have to round up, right, through gravitational of the elements that are being radiated, and then begin to form those into elements ourselves. It makes no difference how many planets there are in a solar system or atomic system, in so far as its substance as an element is concerned. One or more added or subtracted would not change the element into another substance any more than one or more child would affect the nationality of their parents. Transmutation will become simplified by observing that the plane of gyration in relation to amplitude and the speed of revolution of the gyroscopic wheel upon its steel shaft will alone change volume by either multiplying or dividing density. So if we can control, right, the relationship of amplitude to the speed of revolution, we can actually change the volume by either multiplier and dividing density. So really what he's saying is that what these elements are really based upon is their speed of gyration and so on. So if we really want to, get into transmutation, the great possibilities in new metals lie in the proper application of this principle. So how that's accomplished, is it a conscious effort? Is it a mechanical effort? Is it a physics experiment? Is it CERN? I would say that, for me, I think the vibrational element that we're going into within this new consciousness may allow us to actually transmute these by understanding the wave, understanding that these elements are about, because it's just really ether that we're talking about here. So how do you take ether and form it into and transmute it from one phase to the other, which is really from one pressurized zone to the next, right? How do you do that? I don't know. He's not really saying how to do it. He's just saying it's possible.
Well, I guess when we're talking about how the different pressures create the different elements, and the pressure is basically a gravitational pressure.
Correct.
Maybe it's modifying that gravitational pressure, and maybe the reason we don't know how to do that yet is because we don't have a gravitational changing device.
Yeah. Well,
maybe that device is conscious based too. Who knows?
Yeah, and don't forget it's both ways, right? Because you can gravitate something and you can radiate something to a different element also by taking.
Yeah.
So it goes both ways, right? Because like say you want to make something less dense, and you would radiate it, right, to make it less dense, to transmute something into another form. So you can transmute a dense element to a less dense. So you can transmute a solid into a gas, right? Just as you can through gravitation create a solid from a gas, right? So, and
I like what you said about it possibly being conscious as well.
Right.
And I think, this is the ideas that Russell's trying to put forth, is that to become aware. We talked about this some of the very first discussions was, he said there is no unconscious, there's always only not aware. But then there's other areas of consciousness. There's a subconscious, there's the unconscious, there's the conscience. But when we really talk about consciousness and being aware, it's when you look at Gurdjieff's work, where he's saying, you have to visualize yourself, right? You got to be the witness, you know, and not just the participant, but the witness of what's really going on, and becoming aware of your surroundings and how the world works. So through studying these waveforms and through these theories of that, it is the wave, it is the gravitational pressures, it is the radiation that is spiraling out. Through that, can we work with our consciousness to actually begin to transmute materials? And this gets back to the Philosopher's Stone and alchemy, right? This is where we're transmuting things into gold and so on and so forth. So is that possible? You know, I think that as we pursue, as we get rid of some of the blockages that have been put in our place, and we know what Bear would call overlays, right? As we begin to get rid of the ideas that have inhibited us from actually pursuing some of these ideas, we may become more aware consciously and become more almost like magicians in a sense of working with the elements, right? The elementals, to actually begin to transmute elements from one to the other. And with that, that will change a lot of how we interact with our environment. Okay, the last thing that we're going to talk, any questions or comments before we move on from what we were just talking about?
Yeah, maybe. I'm reminded of the Aztec civilizations and so forth. When the Spaniards showed up, gold for them was just decoration. It didn't have a value. And of course, the Europeans took the gold because it had value in their culture. Maybe those earlier cultures had a vestige of a time when this all could still have been done once before.
And I do believe that. I do believe that is information that has been lost. I do believe that there was a time where we had these abilities, but again, over time, we've become, as we, you know, and again, this is really, you know, I don't know, I don't really think it's kind of, I mean, I do believe that there are people who are taking advantage of the situation, but this is really just kind of our fall into matter, right? This is the human experience of the wave as we get higher and, you know, denser and denser into gravitational. At some point, we are going to begin to reverse it. And I think that's what's happening now. And we're beginning to feel the radiation. We're beginning to expand, right? We're beginning to expand our consciousness rather than concentrate our consciousness. And so as we begin to go through this expansion, we will then, because our civilizations throughout the, you know, throughout our history have done this. They've been in the dark periods, they've been in the light periods, you know, they've been in the gravitational wave, they've been in the radiation wave. We may be entering into the radiation wave and getting out of the gravitation. Our fall from matter may be an ascension, right, back into spirit. So these things are, as we transmute, you know, even our consciousness, even as our bodies, as we do these things, to be aware, right, that we have these abilities, that we could have these abilities, that this is possible, will open us up. It's kind of like the 12 monkey principle, right? Once the first guy does it, it becomes easier and easier for the next, the next, and the next. The idea is that if a small group begins to do this or assert it, then it may actually begin to be multiplied, and more will be able to accomplish the same task.
I thought it was 100 monkeys.
It's an 100. Yeah, I'm sure the first 10 were pretty good too.
Kind of thing is, I'm thinking of the cell salts, you know, by using cell salts, Dr. Barr explains that we can, well, rebuild our bodies and with other elements that, you know, I guess other herbs or stuff, we can actually, yeah, change our bodies, you know, all our bodies, like, you know, all the elements of our bodies. And I think with meditation, we can, let's say we can attract better elements that will make us lighter, have more light inside of us. And instead of going in more density, we'll be lighter and may be able to reach, like, I'll say higher thought or the knowing or the source,
Mhm.
So yeah, I think what you said before, like, I think we're in an expansion of consciousness for sure. That's what I get, I think we hit the bottom and we're going to come back up now. Like we went as far as,
Mhm.
we don't want to go any further down in matter. We want to,
There will be those who will descend down farther.
oh,
into matter.
sure, but I'm just
But
saying,
our purpose is that we want to ascend.
yeah, I think so, but anyway.
And like we said, that's you're always either ascending or descending. There is no stasis. That is the wave. I mean, it's like in the Mandalorian, that is the way. Yeah, that is the wave. I mean, the wave is either you're ascending or you're descending, and you can choose through your desire, right? Which way you want to go.
He talks about it, and that's what I was looking in this
Mm.
book, the Glenn Clark book, where Walter Russell says that he had, was with God, with Source,
Mhm.
and they gave him all the download,
Yes.
the Divine Iliad.
So the shape of the universe. So I threw up some pictures here. So this ageless universe has no shape. Again, it's formless, as we've talked about. It has a seeming infinite extension, but that extension is a reflected one. This electric universe of two-way extended light is but a series of mirrors. And again, we talked about the mirror planes. Remember that in the cube? We saw that, the mirror plane. So it's just being mirrored back and forth, right? Which reflect into each other through curved lenses. Again, curved lenses, right? The universe is actually non-curved, but once we put it into the lenses, it becomes curved. It seems extensions might be likened to a light within a mirrored bound room. One light within such a mirrored enclosure would seemingly extend infinitely, but the light thus mirrored would be the same light. The reflected extension would have no reality. The idea of continuity of discontinuity is based upon mirrored effect of an initial cause. Continuity infers time. Time is but one of the effects which constitutes the universe. Time flows two ways, but the senses detect only the forward flow. So that's what, time goes both ways, but our senses that we have, doesn't mean that we can't develop other senses or other bodies that might be able to see the backward flow. And this is what, some people like G.G. Young and other people talk about, that once they get into a trance or trance states, they may be able to actually go back in time or see. They still don't kind of see it in reverse. It's not like they start now and they see, this, they actually go back in time and still see it move forward. So, but they can go back to a point in time. Time flows two ways, but the senses detect only the forward flow. They cannot detect the backward flow, which cancels out the forward flow. Time is as unreal as the wave universe is unreal. Because
go back and get rid of Klaus.
so as we go through this, as we go through these instances that are being recorded, right? We're seeing them move forward. We're seeing that motion. We're seeing that coming in a forward motion. We don't see the reverse of that. We don't really see the radiation wave. We see more the gravitational wave. What is true in principle of one wave is true of all waves. Each wave is a two-way reflected extension of an equilibrium zero, which we call a vibration. So again, the vibration starts. What has vibration, right? Sound has vibration. Waves have vibration. These all have vibrational qualities. Vibration appears, disappears, and reappears from their source of rest to manifest idea, which is existent alone in rest. Just as the vibration of one wave disappears into its zero of the universal stillness, so do all vibrations disappear into the universal zero of stillness. This zero universe of vibrating waves can have no shape other than a seeming one. And so down here, this picture right here is actually a cube that the University of Science and Philosophy, which is philosophy.org, which is Walter Russell's group, they actually created this cube that they put these mirrors in, just as Walter was showing, and they cut the corner out so you could look into it. But when you looked into it, it had one light that shined in it, and in it was reflected all of these different universes. So they were just showing that the principle of this one light going into this mirrored space would then reflect all of these different realities that were just a reflection of the one light.
They used to sell them. They're like $300.
Yeah, I think they still do.
They're out of stock.
Are they? Okay. So, again, talks about the shape of the universe. It talks about, as we see the sun here, we see these asteroid belts also, which is really almost like the idea of the virus, right? Of particles that are coming off of us that are going to go back to the sun, right? And these ideas of these particles of, of waste product as the oblation takes place of the planets and they throw these things off. That is how rings are formed, say around Saturn, I guess around Uranus and so on, Uranus. So the idea of our solar system is, again, the rings, right? The same as the idea of his atom, right? All these cosmoses that we talk about, the inner cosmos, the exterior cosmos, the atomic cosmos, they're all the same structure, all built from light and all built in different pressures. Any questions before we end?
So that means there's nothing new under the sun.
Or from the sun? All right, well, with that, we're going to go ahead and hopefully see if I can get out of this here. And stop recording. So I'm going to stop recording.